This morning, as I mentioned, is Genesis chapter 38, the story of Judah and Tamar. I don't know if you've read this recently, but let me read the first 5 verses in chapter 38. Moses writes, "And it came about at that time that Judah had departed from his brothers and visited a certain Adullamite, whose name was Hira. Judah saw there a daughter of a certain Canaanite whose name was Shua, and he took her and went into her. So she conceived and bore a son named And then she conceived again and bore a son, named him Onan. And she bore still another son and named him Shelah. And this was all at Jebez that she bore him." This passage is sometimes argued about whether it should be in the scripture or not. And it seems kind of a departure. We see the story of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and we see his 12 sons, and then we start to focus in on Joseph, and we get one chapter in on Joseph's life, and then all of a sudden this story is interjected into the text, and then we go back to the story of Joseph. But I think that there's a very specific reasons why this chapter is put in this place. And I think it has a lot of things to say to us. The first thing we read about, Moses says, "And it came about at that time." Now, if you recall in the previous chapter, chapter 37, that was when Joseph told his dreams to his brothers about how someday they would bow down to him. He has a second dream. His brothers and his father will bow down to him. And then they become angry. They see Joseph when he comes out to see how they're doing, and they say, "Hey, you know what? Here comes that dreamer. Here's our brother, the dreamer. Let's kill him." Nice family gathering. And Judah protests. First it's Reuben. He says, "Let's not kill him. Let's just throw him in this cistern." Now, you know, living in Arizona, you can imagine what it's like to be put in a pit on a hot, sunny day with no water. That's real nice. And then to show the coldness of his brothers toward him, it said they hated him. It says after they threw him in the pit, they sat down and had lunch. That's what it says. That's cold. That's hard. And then Judah says, look, he sees the Ishmaelite traders coming. He said, let's not be stupid. Let's not kill him. Let's just sell him as a slave. And that's what they do. So we see Joseph sold into slavery, taken by the Ishmaelites. He goes down into Egypt, and after that he disappears from the life of his brothers for 22 years. And it says, Moses writes, "And it came about at that time that Judah departed from his brothers." That makes perfect sense if you think about it. You know, sometimes in families there's really big problems and disagreements and arguments, and it just affects brothers and sisters. I mean, and sometimes it affects them for life. I always try to tell my boys one thing, you know, when they're upset about something, just forget about it. I mean, let it pass, because we make those decisions all the time. Are we going to get along with our family or not? You have to make that decision. Sometimes your family really does mean things or nasty things, and sometimes it's you or me. And we have to make a decision. Are we going to get along or not? And here the brothers of Joseph sell him into slavery. And it says about that time Judah left. He probably could not take all the inter-family tension that was going on. And it left. And it says he went and visited a certain Adullamite, Canaanite, one of the local people, to visit him. And then it says that he saw the daughter of a certain Canaanite. The Canaanite's name was Shua. He got his daughter, he married the daughter, and they had 3 children. Now you think about what's happening here. Remember Abraham, he came with Sarah, who was one of the people of his land. When Isaac needed a wife, remember they sent Isaac's servant to go back and get a wife for him because they didn't want him to marry a Canaanite. Didn't want him to marry one of the people of the land. Esau, the brother, married 2 Canaanite women. It drove Isaac and Rebekah nuts. That's what the scripture says. Little paraphrase, but that's exactly what it says. And then when Jacob was born, he was sent back to his uncle to go get a wife. So it was wife, Abraham of the people, Isaac, wife of the people, Jacob, wife of the people. His son Judah marries a Canaanite, one of the local people in there. So we see kind of a change starting to happen. In verses 6 to 11, we see another part of this story as it develops. It says, "Now Judah took a wife for his firstborn, and her name was Tamar. But Judah's firstborn, was evil in the sight of the Lord. So the Lord took his life. Then Judah said to Onan, the brother, 'Go into your brother's wife and perform your duty as a brother-in-law to her. Raise up offspring for your brother.' Onan knew that the offspring would not be his, so when he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. But what he did was displeasing in the sight of the Lord, so he took his life also. Then Judah said to his daughter-in-law Tamar, 'Remain a widow in your father's house until my son Shelah grows up.' For he thought, 'I am afraid that he too may die like his brothers.' So Tamar went and lived in her father's house." We have something that in our world today is kind of a strange custom, what's happening in here. But first we have the three sons of Judah. First son, he gets married, and it says he displeased the Lord, and the Lord took his life. I have no idea what he did. The text does not say. But whatever he did, it was such a serious thing that God took his life. There are some people that teach that in the Old Testament God was mean, and then in the New Testament God got nice. It's not really true. It's just that sometimes, to make an example, especially in the early days, we see it in the early days of Genesis, we see it in the early days of Exodus, the nation of Israel being formed. In the early days, the penalties were often pretty immediate to give a lesson to the people that came after them. And that's what was happening here. Married Tamar. He displeased God. We don't know what he did. God took his life. And I think what we're seeing here is part of God's justice. And people really don't like justice. I mean, I know we say we do, but it's not really true. And even if we want justice, we want it for everybody else but us. When somebody else gets what we think they deserve, that's a good thing. And what happened here is that whatever he did was so bad that God took his life. And when that happened, his father, Judah, said to his brother Onan, "Go into your brother's wife, perform your duty as a brother-in-law, and raise up offspring for your brother." Now, this is a strange thing to us today, but it still happens in some cultures of the world. That when the husband died, that wife went to the closest blood relative, and it was that relative's responsibility to raise up an heir to that woman. And there's several reasons why that happens. One is that it was a way to ensure that that woman would be taken care of. There's no welfare system. There's no Social Security. It was a relative. Her son would be raised up to take care of her. Another thing is that it ensured that the family name went on, that would not be left without an heir, that his name would not disappear from the records of Israel, but he would have a son to carry on his name. And another reason it was done was for the ownership of land. Land was very important. You live in an agricultural society and you don't have land, you're going to starve. So this heir was raised up so that the land could be passed from the father onto him. So the family kept the land, the farmland. So all these things were done, and it was a custom even before the law of Moses. Under the code of Hammurabi, this was also happened. It's called a Levirate marriage, and Levirate is Latin for brother-in-law. That the brother-in-law is to raise up an heir. Seems strange to us today, but it was the way that people took care of one another. And then Moses describes Onan. It says Onan knew that the offspring would not be his. See, that child was counted as Er's child, and all the rights that was entitled to passed on to that child. And Onan knew that if he gave his sister-in-law a child, he would get less from the father's estate. But it also describes a little bit about Onan because his life was taken. But this is what it says. So that he went into his brother's wife, he wasted his seed on the ground in order not to give offspring to his brother. The Hebrew wording here is pretty specific, and it talks about a regular practice. Now, the kids are gone, so we can talk like adults. And what's happening here is that Onan liked to have sex with his sister-in-law, but he would pull out prematurely so she didn't get pregnant. So he enjoyed having sex with her, but he wouldn't give her a child. And you get a little picture of what kind of guy this was. He was not unhappy using Tamar for his own sexual gratification, but he wasn't going to give her a child. I mean, that's pretty low life. And it says it was so displeasing to God that he took his life also. To God, this was a despicable act. And just as a little aside, I just want to mention it in a sentence. So many times, people make a claim that the Bible is unfair to women or that God considers women second. And that is not true. And you see from a little thing like this, God saw that this woman was being taken advantage of, and it angered him. And he took this man's life because he took the side of Tamar, who was right. And Onan also dies. Now, Judah had 3 sons, Er, Onan, and Shelah, and he sees Er die, Onan die, and then it says, Shelah was the next person up. He was the next closest blood relative to give Tamar a son, and really, it doesn't say this. This is what is really happening. Judah starts to think that Tamar's bad luck. First boy died, second boy died. That's what he's really saying. He's thinking, he says, listen, he says to Tamar, why don't you go remain a widow in your father's house? Go back to where you came from. And when the little guy grows up, he could be your husband. He could fulfill this responsibility. And it says, for he thought, I'm afraid he too may die like his brothers. He didn't want anybody around this bad luck woman. So he sends her back to her father's house. And she goes and lives there. She took him at his word that someday she indeed would have an heir. But it didn't happen that way. What happened was, let me read this from 12 to 14. It says, now after a considerable time, Shua's daughter, the wife of Judah, okay, this is Judah's wife, the Canaanite, died. And when the time of mourning had ended, Judah went up to his sheep shearers at Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. It was told to Tamar, behold, your father-in-law is going up to Timnah to shear sheep. So she removed her widow's garments, covered herself with a veil, and wrapped herself and sat in the gateway of Anamim, which is on the road to Timnah, for she saw that Shelah had grown up, and she had not been given to him as a wife. So here it says considerable time had passed. Tamar is living back at her father's house. She took Judah at his word that when the youngest son grew up, she would have an heir. And it said considerable time passed. And then Judah's wife died. She was gone. And it says that when the time of mourning had ended, the ritual mourning period, Judah went up to with its sheep shearers to Timnah, he and his friend Hira the Adulamite. So what happens here is that she's gone back to the father's house. She realizes the little boy is grown up. A little boy is probably 20 years old when this happened. And she realizes that Judah has no intention of giving her this last boy, the closest blood relative, to raise up a child for her. That's what she realizes. And after the time of mourning had passed, Judah's wife died. It says he went up with the sheep shearers to Timnah. Now, in those days, and even to this day, in some places in the Middle East, they have the sheep shearing parties. It was, like a carousing time. Everybody brought in the sheep. They all worked really hard and sheared all the sheep and gathered everything. And then they had some blowout party. That's what happened. So it says he went up to the sheep shearers. Judah's on his way to do the work and to have a party. And Tamar hears about this. She's given up hope by now that she's going to get an heir the right way. And she's still wearing her widow's garments for a considerable time. She's mourning the death of her husband. And it says, she removed those clothes, covered herself with a veil, wrapped herself, and sat in the gateway on the road to Timnah. So she takes her widow's clothes off. She wears other clothes, which we'll talk about in a second. And then she covers her face, and she sat on the road that she knew Judah would pass on his way to Timnah. Think also what's in Tamar's mind. Not only does she not have an heir, but Judah himself was not going to have an heir to pass things on, because Shelah was the end of the line. There was no possibility of having another child because his wife died. So to Tamar, this kind of looks hopeless that she's ever going to be taken care of. So she changes her clothes, she sits on the road, and this is what it says in verses 15 to 19. Oh, we have a picture first, Judah and Tamar picture, right? Yeah, there you go. There she is sitting on the side of the road with her veil. There's Judah passing by. And it says, 15 to 19, when Judah saw her, he thought she was a prostitute, for she had covered her face. And he turned aside to her by the road and said, "Here now, let me come into you." For he did not know that she was his daughter-in-law. And she said, "What will you give me that you may come into me?" He said, "Therefore, I will send you a young goat from the flock." She said, "Moreover, will you give a pledge until you send it?" And he said, "What pledge shall I give you?" She said, "Your seal, your cord, and the staff that is in your hand." So he gave them to her and went into her, and she conceived by him. Then she arose and departed and removed her veil and put on her widow's garments. This is one strange story, right? Judah is traveling and he sees his daughter-in-law Tamar. Tamar is a woman that all hope has been removed from. No one has done right by her. No one has helped her. As a matter of fact, she's only been deceived to this point. So she takes off her clothes and she disguises herself and runs into Judah. Now, a lot of people criticize Tamar. We'll talk about that in a minute or two. But what about Judah? I mean, he's on the road and he comes across a woman that he thinks is a prostitute. Tamar changed her clothes, put on the clothes that a prostitute would wear that set her apart, and also veiled her face, which was another thing that a prostitute would do. It was not day-to-day life for a woman to be veiled. And you see that it's from the custom of a woman veiling herself on the night she was married. Remember when Isaac saw Rebekah? Rebekah came, and it says she saw far off, and she said, "Who is that?" And the servant said, "That's my master, Isaac." And when Rebekah knew that that was her future husband, what did she do? It said she got off the camel and she veiled her face, because that's what brides did on the wedding night. They veiled their face. And this custom, this idea of veiling the face for a prostitute, was kind of like a copy of that. It was almost like she's getting ready to have sex with someone. So she veiled her face. That's what she was doing there. And Judah certainly didn't miss the signal. And he said to her, "Listen, I want to have sex with you." And Tamar, she plays the part. She said, "Well, okay, what are you going to give me?" I mean, that's what a prostitute does. That makes some kind of bargain. "What are you going to give me?" And Judah said, "You know what? I'll give you one of my goats. Coming up here, shear the sheep. I have goats." And she said, "You have it with you now?" No. "Well, how do I know you're going to give it to me? Are you going to promise?" She said, "I'll tell you what." He said, "What do you want?" He said, She said, "I want your seal, your cord, and the staff that is in your hand." In those days, can we see the picture of that signet? Is that what I called it in there? I don't know. Documents were sealed. Legal things were done with either a ring like this or some kind of other stamp that was put on a cord around the neck. That's what she says. "I want your seal and your cord." This is the way that Judah would have done all his legal business. This is the way that people would have known that it was Judah. He would have put that seal on there. And that's what she said. "I want your seal." It's a personal thing. Nobody else has it. "I want your seal and your staff," which also was something that was customized. You know, when you see the handle on a cane, they all have different kind of things, or all, you know, whatever. But he would have had a unique cane that only was for him. And she said, I want your seal, I want the cord that it's on, and I want your cane, the things that mark you as an individual. And this shows, too, how clear he was thinking. He said, okay. And he gave it to her. It says, and he went into her, and she conceived, and then she arose and departed, removed the veil, and put on her widow's garments. I don't know how many of you remember Robert Crumb. You know, Mr. Natural. Remember Mr. Natural cartoon? Robert Crumb did a picture of this seal. There you go. What do I give you as a pledge? And he said, what shall I give you? You know, I want something. What do you want? What do you want? I want the 3 most personal things you have. No problem. He gives them to her. Okay, so then, 20 to 21, it says, when Judah sent the young goat, which he promised by his friend the Adulamite, to receive the pledge from the woman's hand, he did not find her. He asked the men of her place, where is the temple prostitute who is by the road at Enaim? But they said, there's been no temple prostitute here. So Judah returned home, let his friend know, listen, I had sex with this prostitute by the road. I owe her a goat. Do me a favor and drop the goat off. That's what he's really saying. And Hira, his friend, the Adulamites, okay, no problem. So he goes out and he's looking for this prostitute and he can't find her. And then he says, where's the temple prostitute? Not just any prostitute, but a temple prostitute. Because when the sheep shearing was going on, the temple prostitutes would come out because they knew that there was a lot of carousing going on. But it shows, too, what was in the mind of Hira, his friend, that this is the kind of religion the Canaanites had. There was a temple prostitute. Part of their religion was involving male and female prostitutes. It's one of the reasons why God told them to stay separate from them. Can you imagine? Just think about the God of Israel, the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the God who throughout Leviticus says, be holy like me, be separate like me, live an honorable life like me. And here in this land, part of the religion is associating with prostitutes. That's why God warned them over and over again. And Judah sends the goat by his friend. He looks out there and he says, where's the temple prostitute? He asked some of the local guys, and they said, there's no temple prostitute here. This is not the place where that happens. And then it says in verse 22 and 23, so he returned to Judah, Hira, and he said, I did not find her. And furthermore, the men of the place said, there's no temple prostitute here. Then Judah said, well, let her keep them, otherwise we will become a laughing stock. After all, I sent the goat, but you did not find her. So Hira says, look, I went around looking for her. I couldn't find her. I asked around. Nobody knew her. And Judah says, listen, let's just let it go. You know, I tried to do the best I could, but if word gets around, this is really going to affect my reputation. He said, I don't want people laughing at me and mocking me, so let's just let it die out. So that's how Judah left it. He figured that his sin was not going to be known by anybody. Let's let it go. And then we see in 24 to 26, he says, now it was 3 months later that Judah was informed, your daughter-in-law Tamar has played the harlot, the prostitute, and behold, she is with child by prostitution. And Judah says, bring her out and let her be burned. And it was while she was being brought out that she sent to her father-in-law, saying, I am with child by the man to whom these things belong. She said, please examine and see. Whose signet ring and cords and staff are these? And Judah recognized them and said, she is more righteous than I, inasmuch as I did not give her my son Shelah. And he did not have relations with her again. It's part of the human condition, I believe. And maybe I'm just admitting my own guilt, so I won't put you in that condition. But I think that you always see other people's sin as worse than your own. I just, and if I happen to sin, it's for a darn good reason. If you sin, that's bad. And I think that Jesus speaks about this when he says, the blind leading the blind. He said, why do you look at the speck in your brother's eye but not notice the log that is in your own eye? You hypocrite, first take the log out of your own eye, and then you'll clearly see the speck that is in your brother's eye. This is Judah. He has sex with a prostitute. He tries to buy her off, comes back, find out his daughter. He says, hey, your daughter's, she was a prostitute. And he goes, hey, she should get burned. What the heck is the matter with her? And Tamar, she's a genius. She really is. I mean, this woman was really mistreated. I know it sounds so bizarre in our society today, but in that society, she had the right to have a child by the closest blood relative in order to keep her land, in order to keep her name, and in order to provide for herself for the future. That was the right given to her under the law. And Judah refused to do it. And it turns out that he himself was the person who provided that heir. That is really a strange twist to the story. And when he decides that she deserves to be burned because of her horrible sin, she said, hey, listen, not sure exactly who this is, but maybe you'll recognize this stuff. And it shows that underneath everything, there's something in Judah, because I don't know exactly how it transpired, and the text doesn't say really, really clearly, but she sent those things to him. It was between him and her still. That's another thing about this woman. She had real integrity. She could have gone into the public square. Yeah, I'm pregnant. This guy, this. She didn't do that. She sent to him privately. I think that's pretty amazing. And she also trusted that he would do the right thing. So she said, I'm pregnant by this guy. And Judah says, oh my goodness. And his conclusion is, she's more right than I am. I didn't do what I was supposed to do. She had to go out of her way and do something strange in order to get what she deserves. And Judas just admits that he was wrong. And it says, too, that he did not have relations with her again. I think Moses mentions that because he did it in ignorance. He didn't do it. He didn't know. I mean, it's not like he wanted to have sex with his daughter-in-law. He had no idea. And it's not that she really wanted to have sex with her father-in-law. She wanted an heir and would not get it. So she took matters into her own hands. Verse 27 to 30, it says, it came about at the time that she was giving birth, that behold, there were twins in her womb. Moreover, it took place that while she was giving birth, one put out a hand, and the midwife took and tied a scarlet thread on his hand, saying, this one came out first. But it came about, as he drew back his hand, that behold, his brother came out. And she said, what a breach you have made for yourself. So she named him Perez. And afterwards his brother came out who had the scarlet thread on his hand, and he was named Zerah. It's a strange ending to the story, too. She has twins. And it says first the hand came out and she tied the scarlet cord. Why? Because remember, in that society, the firstborn got a double portion. The firstborn was the inheritor. The firstborn was the heir. She tied that on there so when they both came out, they'd remember who was who. That's what she did. But, I mean, and you know, I'm not an expert on birth, but if a hand comes out first, that's not a good sign. That's not what you're looking for. And then it says he took his hand back in. And then his brother comes out, Perez. It says, what a breach. Literally what it means is you have broken out. It's like, Perez, you passed your brother. How did that happen? That's why she called him that. Like the hand comes out, scarlet cord, hand goes back in, the other guy comes out. She says, what's going on here? He broke out first. But it was God's plan that Perez be the older. It was God's plan that he be the inherited one, regardless of the scarlet thread and the cord. He wasn't actually born first. You saw his hand first. But it wasn't God's plan. God reversed. I mean, that's a really weird thing, isn't it? A hand comes out, a hand goes back, the other guy comes out. What the heck is going on? God's plan. God's behind it. God designed it. So let me say a couple of things about this passage, because I think it is kind of a strange passage, but first of all, there's a recurring theme so far in the book of Genesis. And that theme is that God's plan always moves forward regardless of the failings of God's people. That's really important. We see that over and over and over and over again. God's plan moves forward regardless of his fail. He uses people for his plans, but the success of God's plan doesn't rest on the faithfulness of his people. God always uses people, but if people are faithless, if people fail, if people sin, God's plan moves ahead anyway. And we are privileged to take part in the plan, but if we fail, he will succeed anyway. What happens when we don't go along, try to understand, be obedient, be a part of God's plan? We just miss out on the blessing. Because God's plan is going to happen anyway. And I don't know if that's happened to you, but it's happened to me. At different times when I had the opportunity to be involved in different things and I didn't for whatever reason, and then I saw it happen anyway, it's just a horribly sad feeling. I could have been a part of that, but I wasn't. And I think that's what we see here. These people failed quite often. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, the 12 sons, we see this over and over again, but God has a plan and he keeps moving in a plan. That's very encouraging to me. Another thing that we see in the book of Genesis over and over again is that from the very beginning of God choosing Abraham, he was protecting the line of the Messiah. God promised Abraham that he would give him many things, and he said in the end of the promise, I will bless all the families of the earth through you. And the ultimate fulfillment of that blessing was the Messiah, Jesus, when he was born. And from the very beginning, from Abraham all through, up until the time that Jesus is born, God protected the line of the Messiah. He intervened over and over and over again. Remember, Abraham went down into Egypt, and he told Pharaoh that Sarah was his sister. And Pharaoh said, hey, this is one good-looking woman. I'm taking her for my wife. Well, it says God closed up the wombs of everyone in the house. And Pharaoh said, oh, there's some kind of problem going on here. God protected the line of the Messiah, regardless of the faithfulness or faithlessness of his people. Judah, the Messiah comes through Judah. He's the promised line now of all the 12 sons. And what happens? He has no heir. He has no kids. There's no children. First son dies. Second son dies. Third son, we don't hear anything about him getting married. If it wasn't for Tamar's actions, humanly speaking, the line of the Messiah would end. That's kind of a crazy thing. And I think that Tamar had this great desire to keep the descendants and the line continuing, even though she did it in what we would consider kind of a bizarre way. But she was within her rights at the time. The law required the closest blood relative to raise up an heir for her. Judah refused to do it, so Tamar took the matter in her own hands. It's very similar to Jacob when he deceived his father to get the blessing. The blessing belonged to Jacob. The way that Jacob got the blessing was not right, but it was always God's plan for him to have the blessing. Same thing here. The line of Judah was the line of the Messiah. God promised it. And we don't know what would have happened if Tamar didn't do this. We don't know how God would have responded, but he would have done something. But Tamar kind of, jumped over God's plan here. But something that I think is interesting is that we don't see Tamar condemned in the text. And I think that's really important. When Joseph told his father what happened with his brothers, it says he brought back a bad report, and some people say Joseph was a tattletale. Text doesn't condemn him. And the same thing here with Tamar. She's not condemned in the text. She did what she did. Perhaps it wasn't, let's say 100% kosher. But it was within her rights, and God sticks up for her. And we even see that maybe the opposite is true, because there's some interesting thing. I don't know if I should mention, I'll mention Ruth, because Ruth is also, and I want to talk about the book of Ruth just for 2 seconds, because it's so incredible how it ties in. But Ruth was also in the line of Messiah. The book of Ruth, very short book, but Ruth was a Moabite. Do you remember how the Moabites came into existence? I know we looked at it a while ago, but Lot God destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. Lot and his 2 daughters escaped because the son-in-law, the angel said, listen, this place is going to be destroyed. Lot told his sons-in-law that the place is going to be destroyed, and says they laughed at him like he was nuts. Hey, there's going to be a great fire. Everything's going to be destroyed. Yeah, okay, Pop. That's good. So Lot escapes with his 2 daughters. And the 2 daughters, when they were up in the mountains after they had escaped, they said, the entire world is destroyed. And we're never going to have any children. So you know what? The older sister said, let's get Dad really drunk, and then we'll take turns sleeping with him. And they both got pregnant by their drunken father. The first daughter had a son. He's the father of the Moabites. Ruth was a Moabite. And she winds up in the line of the Messiah. Isn't that beyond belief? That's incredible. That God takes something horrible and he makes something good out of it. Because Ruth is very highly respected in the scriptures. Why? Because God took something that was bad and he made it something good. So it says too, Naomi returned from Moab accompanied by Ruth the Moabite. That's what she's called, Ruth the Moabitess. Now, I want to read you, I'll read it quickly because it's a section from Ruth chapter 4. Now, listen to this in light of what this whole story about Judah and Tamar. Now, Boaz, if you remember, Boaz was a close blood relative of Ruth, but not the closest. There was one other that was closer. So what happened was, when they came back into the land, Ruth needed somebody to watch over her. Boaz fell in love with her. She fell in love with Boaz, but there was somebody in between them. Somebody else, the closest blood relative, had the first right to have a relationship with her. It says, now Boaz went up to the gate where all the business of the town was, sat down, and behold, the close relative of whom Boaz spoke, the one that was between them, came passing by, and he said, turn aside, friend, and sit down here. And he turned aside and sat down. And he took the 10 men of the elders of the city and said, sit down here, official business. And he said, so they sat down. And he said to the closest relative, Naomi, who has come back from the land of Moab, had to sell the piece of land which belonged to our brother Elimelech. So I thought to inform you, saying, buy it of those who are sitting here before the elders of my people. If you redeem it, redeem it. But if not, tell me that I may know. For there is no one but you who may redeem it, and I am after you. See, so Boaz is using that same rule, that same law, that the closer relatives entitled first to the land. And Boaz says, look, if you want the land, you can buy it. You want to buy it? And the guy says, sure, I'll take the land. And then Boaz said, on that day you buy the field from the hand of Naomi. You must also acquire Ruth, the Moabitess, the widow of the deceased, in order to raise up the name of the deceased on his inheritance. See, it's that same thing. You can get the land, but you also have to marry Ruth, because she needs to have someone to inherit. She needs to be protected. She needs to be watched. She's going to get the land. And the close relatives thinking, oh yeah, I'm going to raise up a son for Ruth, and then I'm going to lose the land. That's what he's thinking. And it says, the closest relative said, I cannot redeem it for myself because it would jeopardize my own inheritance. Redeem it for yourself, and you may have the right of redemption, for I cannot do it. So this is it's the same law. Ruth needs a husband. That's what's going on. So it says, Boaz marries her. Then listen to this in verse 11, going back to Tamar. She's mentioned in Ruth chapter 11, which a lot of people don't notice, but it says, all the people who are in the court, the elders said, we are witnesses. They were witnesses that Boaz now would marry Ruth and raise up an heir for her. May the Lord make the woman who is coming into your home, Ruth, like Rachel and Leah, which is still a blessing today among the Jewish people. You always pray that your daughter will be like Rachel and Leah. He says, Rachel and Leah, both of whom built the house of Israel, and you may achieve wealth in Ephratah, become famous in Bethlehem. Moreover, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah through the offspring which the Lord will give you by this young woman. She's held in high esteem in Ruth. May Ruth, may your wife bear children and have her name be great like Tamar. The scripture actually holds her up in high esteem. through the whole series of events as very strange to our culture, she pursued what was right, and she becomes honored by the text. That's the simple conclusion. This woman had a lot of guts. She really did. She was a woman who was cast aside, left alone. She just pursued until she got what was rightfully hers, and in the end, the scripture praises her. I think that's pretty incredible. And listen to the genealogy in Matthew. You know, we often skip over these. I know we've spoken about it before, but it's important to God. Listen to the genealogy. Here's the record of genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, the son of David, the son of Abraham. Abraham was the father of Isaac. Isaac the father of Jacob. Jacob the father of Judah and his brothers. Judah was the father of Perez and Zerah by Tamar, mentioned by Matthew. Perez was also the father of Hezron, Hezron the father of Ram, Ram the father of Amminadab, Amminadab the father of Nahshon, Nahshon the father of Salmon, Salmon was the father of Boaz by Rahab. Remember the story of Rahab? She was a prostitute. Before she came to faith in Israel, she was a prostitute. And then it says Boaz was the father of Obed by Ruth. Obed was the father of Jesse, Jesse the father of David. 3 women named in that first genealogy. Unbelievable story. Tamar, what a strange and crazy story. Rahab, former prostitute. Ruth, the Moabitess, all listed in the genealogy of Jesus. And here, I think we see from this that God often uses broken people. I mean, some of these people, you read this story, we read a list of names, blah, 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 blah. Let me get to the interesting part now. These people, it's incredible. What an encouragement to us. God uses, He used broken people in the line of Jesus himself. That says a lot about the character of God. And one last thing quickly that we see from this section, and this is one of the reasons why I think it's important that the section is in there, and it's important the placement of the section. When we open up, we see Judah, right? He's got a problem with his brothers. He goes away. He's the line of the Messiah. And what does he do? He goes away, and he finds a Canaanite woman to marry. He starts to intermarry with the people of the land. His grandfather didn't. His father didn't. I mean, his great-grandfather, his father, and none of them married Canaanite women. Judah did. And he's the line of the Messiah. So you see the people that God has chosen, the family line of Abraham, starting to blend in with the people of the land and intermarry. And I believe this story is in here because it precedes the nation of Israel going into the land of Egypt. It was not a good time for them at the end. It was in the beginning, but not at the end. But why did God send them down to Egypt? Because of what was happening. They were starting to blend into the people of the land. This was God's unique people, the people that God chose to be his witness to the world. And they started to get dispersed, and they started to spread out, and they started to pick up the customs of the Canaanites. And God said, no, I want to prevent this. So what does he do? He takes Jacob and his children, and he brings them down into the land of Egypt. Why? It preserved the nation of Israel. It preserved those people. It kept them separate. And from there, they reigned a very distinct people. Remember, the Egyptians didn't like them. When they first went in, Joseph said, put them up in the land of Goshen. That was a part separate from the nation of Egypt. There was a little separate part. Why? Because they were the horrible shepherds that the Egyptians hated. And it was through that God kept his people unique and kept his people separate. And he sends, this story is the bridge of how God is sending Joseph down to be able to set everything up to take care of his people. We see the reason why. This section to me obviously fits in here. I think it's specifically designed to teach us, the several different things. I think it's encouragement that God uses broken people. It's always the recurring theme in Genesis, encouragement to me. God's plan will always come about. Always, always, always. What a great thing. How do you know he's coming back someday? How do you know you're going to heaven with him? How do you know that one day evil will be punished? How do you know that one day the wrongs will be made right? How do you know that? How can you possibly know that? Because all throughout history, God's plan proceeds. And it will proceed until that final day. God's plan will always proceed. And we, through the grace of God and the work of Jesus, have a part of in that plan as broken people. We can also have a part in that. Let's pray.